Ooh, hello. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Game Audio Hour. This is episode 189 of the Fortnightly podcast, where we discuss all things game audio, from creative ideas to the latest techniques, project experiences to audio secrets. Here is where you'll find in-depth coverage and opinions related to game audio, and here is where you'll find Alex. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. Actually, it's been extremely hot in Stockholm for the past week. Kind of a bit of a heat wave. It's been about 30, which is, I don't know, 100 and what is that? 6? I don't know. I have no idea. But it's been quite warm for the past week. And just last night there was some pretty fierce thunderstorms, and it's gotten a lot cooler today. So I'm much better today than I was at this time yesterday. Gotta love those thunderstorms. Like, talk about bass. That's some real bass.
Man, thunderstorms are the best. Did you actually record any of that? I mean, I know in LA, whenever there's a thunderstorm, the sound designers on my Twitter feed on Facebook are saying, "Oh yeah, thunderstorm tonight. Time to break out the recorders and go outside under, oh yeah, I prepared the perfect awning for recording this particular thunderstorm." Everyone's all gleeful and excited.
Yeah, that would have been nice. Unfortunately, it was also 4 a.m. in the morning, and said thunderstorm was not actually something I was expecting, so I was not prepared with an awning for my recording device. So no, sadly, I did not capture that one.
That's too bad. But speaking of preparation, we know this guy's always prepared. Mike, how are you doing?
Well, speaking of extremely loud noises, as you know, it's within 3 months of the 4th of July on either side, which means it's time for fireworks in Van Nuys, California. And I've never before needed a sound pressure level meter as something I could potentially take to the police. But it are so loud here. They're coming from like a block away, and there's clearly some kind of fireworks mortar involved, because you can hear the initial like firing, and then half a second later you hear the detonation and all the car alarms go off. So it is an exciting time to be here, and I do not mean that in a good way, but I'm doing great.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you're doing well. Chase, down here, you look like you're doing pretty well. How are things going over there?
It's going pretty cool. I got the AC on. I am drinking my little lemon elderflower soda. I am laughing because I did go to Van Nuys High, and I know how loud it gets over there. But I'm in Moore Park, and it's not 30 degrees or 30 Celsius, which is 86 Fahrenheit, which is actually pretty decent. But other than that, I'm doing pretty well.
Okay, that is great to hear. This is a strong start to this episode of the Game Audio Hour. And oh my God, am I doing it? I'm doing it. I'm trying to make things.
You're doing it.
I'm trying to make things smooth transitions. Screw that. All right. No, but no, we're talking about starts. I figured it might be good to start with something that I saw on Twitter earlier last week. So on Twitter, Matesk, he was asking some stuff on the hashtag Game Audio Dev, and I thought this was kind of cool. Hey, game audio dev, lots of advice on what to get when you're starting out. But how about what shouldn't you get? What's actually bad, a waste of money, not worth the hype, or not needed till later in your career? What would be the year one worst purchase? And, there was some interesting conversation that happened around this, both on Twitter in the thread, if you find this tweet, as well as in some other audio circles on the web. Like someone mentioned, what was it? Someone had to mention something about booking an orchestra for a demo submission. Is that something that you do as a first year starting out person or whatnot? I mean, it's easy to think about the ridiculous things that people can or might do when starting out. But what about some of the subtler things that are like, oh man, is that really good advice? Maybe that's good advice. Maybe it's not. Is anything coming to mind for you guys?
I would say
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that for most people starting out, incorporating yourself is probably not necessary. It may serve as a kind of validation. It may be cool to say, I'm Bob Schmeckelfield, Inc. But the overhead in terms of registration fees and the bookkeeping and needing to pay yourself, I think, as an employee, all that stuff. So that would strike me as a somewhat frivolous use of your money early in your career. And possibly the same could be said for lesser forms of business formalization, such as an LLC, because you're probably not going to get sued. But I'm open to debate on that second point.
Yeah, I think that different countries may have different sort of taxation stipulations about that particular point. Like I think in some cases, if you are working on a contract, receiving money, and then paying tax on that as income, then different countries may require that you have some kind of corporate entity in order to register that under. But yeah, I guess the larger advice is just check it out. Don't assume that you need to be a company in order to get started, but just check it out to see what the rules are for your country.
I'm actually kind of wondering about this. Who is a corporate entity of some sort? Because I'm not actually. I'm just me right now. I've done some contracts, but I've always just done it as, oh yeah, it's me. It's my sole proprietorship. You know, whatever. I just put that as part of my personal taxes, and it's a little bit annoying. And every now and then I think, oh yeah, maybe I should form an LLC or something. But I haven't done quite so much work as to justify that in my mind.
Are you guys, Chase and Mike, what's your sort of legal status as far as being freelance sound people?
For me, I've been a sole proprietor for over a decade, I want to say now. And it's just easier to file that way in terms of like taxes and such. And like Mike had mentioned, like as long as you follow the rules, you know, you're being, you know, respectful of your NDAs, you're most likely not going to get sued. So it's, you know, I would say, yeah, there's no reason for me to spend more money to try to like do a big corporate incorporation type of thing, because that stuff costs a lot. I know in California, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was like $700 to kind of at least get like an LLC, and then we don't even want to talk about like what S corps and such like that. But since I've never had an intern, I don't hire anyone else except for the musicians I have for the scores that I write. So it's like I don't really see the point of really doing it. And like I said, like as long as you're cognizant of your NDAs and you're professional in all mannerisms, then you could be okay with just a sole proprietorship.
How about you, Mike? You also a sole proprietor?
Yeah, my situation is similar to everyone else who's spoken thus far, but I do want to put an asterisk because, Alex, you may have slightly overgeneralized the spirit of my original anti-advice. And even though I don't think that beginners need to be in a corporation or maybe not even an LLC, that does not mean you shouldn't be a business. You absolutely should have a separate business account and business credit card. You should file an FBN if you're in California, or the equivalent registration in other states. So I don't want to go on the record of saying, commingle your business and personal funds. You definitely don't want to do that.
Yeah, that whole thing of the separate accounts is the one thing that I do have. So I do have a separate account that I use. I do have a business credit card, but there's nothing really to it. I mean, it's still my credit card, but it just helps so much once it does come down to tax time and knowing where the numbers are actually going. And so far, that's enough for me.
Cool. Were there any other posts in that thread that you guys saw that you thought was especially relevant? I have to say, the one thing that I felt, definitely on the software side, it's really, really easy to make an assumption that you need all of the plugins, all of them. Just get them all because you're serious about what you're doing, so you just need the plugins. And a lot of them are not too expensive, really, for very high quality results. And so there's kind of a temptation to just sort of jump in there and just buy up all of the sort of mid-priced, low-priced plugins that you can, so that you can feel serious about what you're doing. But I'll definitely agree with some advice offered by a few people in that thread that said, you don't really need all of those plugins. You're going to get, perfectly usable professional results from native stock DAW plugins, regardless of which the DAW is, because they're all very, very competitive these days. And I think the mistake that I definitely made when I started out was getting just a little bit too excited by all of the options and all of the different things that you can get, to forgetting that actually what's really important is to learn something absolutely thoroughly. And there's no better place to start in learning than the native plugins in your DAW environment. So I definitely agree with that one. Yeah,
definitely agree there. I got to admit, even though this wasn't a year one purchase for me, but in the early 2010s, I went and got a Waves bundle. Because it seemed like everyone was getting Waves bundles. All right, these seem good. There was a decent sale at the time. I bought it. I played around with it. And then I realized I just never used it. It just wasn't part of my workflow. I wasn't that excited about that. I think there is something to buying something just because it is considered an industry standard. Even early on. I mean, maybe if you have absolutely nothing there, but so much of what Waves does is actually just incrementally and sometimes significantly better versions of the things that we do have in our DAWs. We have good EQs, good reverbs, good delays. The stuff that's stock in a free DAW like Cakewalk. I just went back into Cakewalk again just to see how good this free DAW is. It's still really good. It is a top-notch professional digital audio workstation that just so happens to be free now. And the stuff that's stock in there is quite good. There is something to not getting those industry standard stuff right away. I think especially as a game sound designer, just because you don't necessarily need to work to industry standards. You're typically not working alongside other people in the same studio working on the same, say, Pro Tools workstation, and thus you have to know exactly how Pro Tools works. The studio is not going to accommodate you. You have to learn it. But for most sound designers that are working out, that's really not the case that they're working in at all.
I was going to actually say that, what do you think about Pro Tools in general? Like, if you're starting out, obviously, the Pro Tools likes to call itself the industry standard, and in many parts of the broader industry of sound production, Pro Tools is the industry standard. But for game audio, would you recommend that people get Pro Tools, or is Reaper fine? What do you think?
I think it's interesting you brought that up. It's actually on one of the lists I was trying to decide based on like the Vice stuff that I was going to talk about. But just to answer your thing, I think personally, I was certified in Pro Tools 7, and then Pro Tools 8 came out like a month later, and I spent money on that certification. It was not cheap. And then you cannot go into a different, you could not apply for like studios as such if you weren't at a certain certification level. Typically some would accept you, some wouldn't, but it just made it difficult, right? So I'd spent months trying to learn the certification, and then I moved to 8, and not a lot changed. So it really was like a tier system, and obviously this is when it was DigiDesign and not Avid. But that being said, when I was in school, like for audio engineering several years ago, the MIDI was really bad. And a lot of us in the industry just know, like, you do not write in Pro Tools. You just don't do it. It's going to be it's possible, but it's just not going to be as efficient, and the workflow is not going to be as great. Now, on the mixing side, in dialogue editing, I feel that it's still a good competitor. And I visited it about a couple of years ago, and it still has its chops about it and such like that. So like any tracking, recording, mixing, or dialogue editing or anything in terms of like where game audio is involved with that, which is very heavy, then yeah, absolutely give it a shot, keep it going. But if you want to write composition, I salute you.
Chase, if I'm going to ask for your opinion on this.
Okay.
If Earth established a colony far away, and an internet connection between Earth and the colony wasn't so good. And the first sound designers were starting from scratch, building a brave new world. And they could start an entirely new tradition with any DAW for sound design specifically. Do you think Pro Tools would have a leg up, assuming nobody there had any skills on any particular DAW? They had to start from scratch.
Sound design only, right?
Sound design and mixing, everything other than MIDI.
Sound design, yes.
So you think a brand new colony of tabula rasa sound designers starting afresh with the option to use any tool in the world and develop a skill set from ground zero would all still migrate to Pro Tools as their first choice?
Okay, so
Hold on. You
want the short answer or you want the long answer?
You said the internet connection wasn't good. I mean, they're going to have to download updates through that Avid updater every now and then, right? So it's like, ugh.
Well, the supply ship will come by every 6 months with some hard drives. But the reason I said that is just so that we wouldn't take the existing expertise base into account. What I'm getting at is if everyone had to start over and all the legacy experts in Pro Tools suddenly had simultaneous heart attacks, so the entrenchment was no longer a factor, do you think Pro Tools would once again rise to be the standard?
Probably not.
Oh, man. Michael Hoffman in the chat says, if you're in space, no internet, say goodbye to iLock. So
we got the iLock hate party going strong. That hate train for iLock, it's here.
I don't want to tempt fate. I've got an iLock that's currently working right now, and I'm using it for a couple of plugins. So I'm not going to badmouth it right now. You've been treating me very nicely, iLock. Thank you. Oh man, let's see.
Did I miss anything? I'm back. Did I miss anything? My connection dropped.
Oh man, you missed. We can't even repeat that one.
Oh, okay.
Well, let's keep on going on. There's some interesting things in the response to Matt's thread. Let's see. You probably don't need sound miner or bass head. Actually, I wonder about that. Do any of you guys use that?
I would agree with that.
You would agree?
I would definitely agree. I'll definitely agree with that because the media browser in Reaper is actually, personally I find it quite a bit better than the other options. It's blazingly fast in terms of search performance and just sort of browsing stuff, and it's really, really fast. So yeah, I would sort of agree that I've never ever felt a need for anything more than the Media Explorer in Reaper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would also agree with that. It's been treating me pretty well. I've played around with some of those things, but honestly, SoundMiner and Basshead are pretty expensive purchases, and don't need that. Not at the current amount of stuff that I'm doing, and honestly, I can't even imagine that moving forward. Here's something that came up. GDC, just a few people in the thread mentioned, is GDC a necessary investment as a sound designer moving forward? What do you guys think?
Wow, that is a good one.
That was what was on my list to speak about, and I'll keep it brief. I was at GameStoneCon. I had already done stuff in game audio some years ago, but my first GameStoneCon, I think it was in 2013 or something like that. And there was a talk by someone who was a veteran in the industry. And he said, and I'll never forget, he said, to be taken seriously in game audio, you must attend GDC. Not once, but not twice, but at least 6 or more times to be sure that you are consistent, that we will take you as competition or whatever, or as someone that's here to stay by showing up there. And I thought I was kind of blown away, honestly. I was like, we all know that's not a very easy conference to get to. It's very expensive. So yeah, in terms of bad advice, I'm going to actually put that one out there because I don't necessarily concur with that at all.
I would definitely agree. I think you guys are where you are located. You're extremely lucky because it's a little more than double the cost for me to get to GDC than it is for you. And I've never lived in a place where it hasn't been the case. I lived in Japan before, Japan to San Francisco, not cheap. Now I live in Stockholm to San Francisco, definitely not cheap. And in terms of the value that you get out of GDC, I don't know. It's a tough one. I think that I remember that early on when I first started like doing game audio stuff, it was not so much useful for the lectures, but more useful for all the networking and the sort of parties and stuff like that goes on. If you don't really know very many people, then I wonder, like, I mean, you get some opportunities by just sort of chatting to the person next to you in a lecture theatre or somebody in the line with you or something like that. But then if you are in San Francisco at the time of GDC and you know one person who's going to, you know, one of the sort of after like the evening meetups or drinks parties or stuff like that, and you just go along and have them introduce you to some people, or you just go there and be friendly and talk to people, it's kind of the same thing. So actually, in our case, like I went to 2 GDCs actually going to it, and then after that I did sort of the anti-GDC, which is where you are just there at that time, but you don't actually pay the $1,000 for the door entry to GDC itself.
Yeah. You
just, you know, meet as many people as you can outside of GDC itself because everybody happens to be there. So that's kind of a sort of a GDC hack, if you because for most people who don't happen to live in California, GDC is really, really, really expensive.
Agreed. Yeah, besides being in relatively close proximity to GDC, I took advantage of it by writing about GDC. I did a lot of journalism. I basically said to GDC, hey, me and my cohort here, we write about the games industry. We had a website. We actually set this up quite a few years back, starting in 2001. So it's not like we weren't doing work. We were like really faking it till we made it. We were actually, in fact, making it. But my first years going to GDC, we're doing it for just the cost of travel expenditure, which wasn't much since I was just a drive down the 5. And we were writing about various lectures, writing about the people that we met. And I was trying to do my networking as a game audio guy at the same time. And it worked out all right. I mean, when I think about it, I feel like I did make some friends. I did make some good relationships there. But were they the bulk of what led up to the success of my career as it is right now? I'm not sure it is, actually. I would probably put a little bit more of that to school, as well as some other things like, art students that I just happened to meet in other venues that actually weren't GDC, but were, in fact, other creative conference type events. So, GDC is cool, but yeah, it's definitely expensive. And I definitely would not say that this is a must attend. And certainly not the every year thing that guy was telling you, Chase.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good, what you mentioned there, Vince, it's a good idea. It's not so much GDC itself that's important. It's going to these kinds of events and being active in the scene and, starting off by finding what kind of events are happening, no matter the scale, even if they're really small, in the local vicinity of where you live. I think that's a good key piece of advice, more so than like GDC is the mother lode of all opportunity in the game industry. That's not really the case.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not necessarily true anymore either. I mean, you're looking at Gamescom, which has got triple the amount of attendees, that plus E3 attendees, what I'm saying? Like there are so many game conferences now. There's no way you'd be able to hit them all. But that just shows that you can scale your way around and still get projects and get gigs and still be, have your career and still build your career and somewhat more locally than trying to have it, across the world somewhere. I'm not sure if GDC China still was doing their thing and stuff like that. But regardless, like you were saying, Alex, like in your own municipal, like meetup.com or whatever Facebook groups are having those type of things, like just go out and just start there. And you'll find a lot of times, they'll mention GDC, the people that were going there that could afford to go there, to just in your backyard. And then guess what? You made a connection.
Before we leave this topic, I did just one thing that I saw in advice that I wanted to get your guys' opinions on was monitoring setups. So some people there advise against getting speakers or against getting sort of high quality headphones for monitoring game audio. What do you all think about that advice? Where should somebody start? Like flipping it around, is if I'm thinking, I want to get into game audio, do you think that that's a wise place to put your early, capital, if you call it, like your early sort of startup money into monitoring equipment? What do you think?
Well, I do have an opinion on that. I think it's worth putting some money into it. Basically, I don't think it's worth it if you are just starting out getting $1,000 set of Neumann studio monitors, or even necessarily that $500 setup of KRKs or M audios. But once you get up to a certain level, you get to the point where you have equipment that is at least worth learning, despite whatever technical foibles it has. So you don't need a $500 headset, but also a $10 headset doesn't have enough there that you can learn. But, hey, a $50 to $100 headset, that's actually, I think, worth learning. When I went to USC, there were a lot of professors there that had some opinions when it came to what is worth it. But this one professor really talked about, hey, here is what is worth living with. Here are the things that you can live with for a while. And as you live with it, you will actually get better at your craft by doing so. And he had a nice short list of some of these things, like the Sony 7506 headphones, which are pretty ubiquitous for a lot of sound designers. Now, if you go to a lot of forums, people will poo-poo them for things like, oh yeah, the headband is actually not all that strong. The ear cups are kind of shallow. But they're actually good. They sound good enough, and you can learn with it, and you can live with it. And that's in fact what I did. I lived with it, and I learned my craft over the course of the 4 years that thing survived before the ear pads kind of messed up the way that cheaper headphone ear pads do. There is a point where I think you can spend just enough and get something that's worth learning. And often that just means, something that is incrementally better as well as incrementally more expensive than the bargain basement stuff.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's really good advice, I think. It's often like, where is that sweet spot of not being so expensive, but also being decent enough quality to have some depth to it that you can learn and actually use on a daily basis to get decent quality. I think I guess that's a topic for another time, because that's a big topic.
Yeah.
What speakers, what headphones, what is sort of that sweet spot of affordability and functionality?
Yeah, and it's changing, because the industry is changing, manufacturing has changed over the last decade. So the answers now are totally different than the answers from 10 years ago.
For sure. Yeah. Vince, I have a Reaper question for you. So I found this funny behavior in Reaper actually, and I was wanting to do it on the so we're talking about Logic and orchestra sample libraries, and just keeping Mike awake. I'll just drop in every now and then like a Logic reference just to keep Mike awake. I've noticed that in Reaper you have the EXS24, which is now called the no, sorry. Okay. Let's get on with it. One of the things that I like to do is synthesize sound effects, and so I do that. I create a patch in something like Yuhi Bazil or something like that, and if I want to do sort of round robin style synthesized sound effects, I will create the patch, create a MIDI clip in Reaper to trigger the sound from the soft synth, and then duplicate that region in Reaper 10 times. I do that so that when I render, I will get 10 instances of the same sound, which are slightly different because they're all rendered in real time by the software synthesizer. So it's another way to get some variation in synthesized sound effects beyond just sort of randomizing pitch or sort of like the standard go-tos for avoiding that sort of machine gun repetitive sound effect problem, right? So that's sort of a standard thing that I will do. Now, I discovered something very interesting about Reaper, the way that Reaper does this, and I suspect, Vince, you might be able to tell me why. I found that if I have the same MIDI clip, which is usually just triggering one note out of the software synthesizer, if I set regions for all of them, and I say, go render these 6 regions of the same MIDI clip through this software synthesizer, Reaper actually renders all 6 regions as exactly the same sample, which is not what I want. What I want is for it to render the MIDI clip, play the software synthesizer once, then play it again, then play it again, and then play it again 6 times, so the sample is slightly different because it's being rendered freshly on every time. Now, I discovered a workaround. The workaround is if you freeze the track, as in you render the track inside Reaper to a sample, and then chop that sample up into the 6 regions and export those, then I get 6 unique versions of the same patch, which is what I want. So you can see the waveform, they're slightly different, and when you trigger them repetitively through Wise or Fmod or through the middleware, it sounds what I want to sound like, which is like more dynamic, because they're all different samples, essentially. My question is, do you have any idea why it is that Reaper, when you just render the project with each region as a MIDI clip, why is it actually producing exactly the same sample for each one of those MIDI clips, rather than rendering it like a track and then chopping up the sample?
Yeah. I confess, I'm not sure if I know exactly why, but when you described what's happening, I thought, oh yeah, that does make sense. Regions, I think, do in fact operate that way, where it's basically like it's reinitializing the project and then treating that new time selection, whether you're doing it as time selection or as a region, it's bam. Right. It's just like a reinitialized project at that point. I kind of got a hint of how exactly Reaper handles that, not from your particular situation, but when I was trying to mess around with the render queue in Reaper.
Right.
And I realized that when I was doing significantly larger projects, it was in fact unloading and reloading the project every time, for every entry in the queue. And I thought, wow, this is actually really obnoxious, especially when I'm dealing with larger things, especially big orchestral queues. So I changed the way that I worked. And instead of dealing with that, I instead dealt with a more extensive, robust version of my stems throughout my templates, as well as routing. So if I was trying to do things with, not on a music scale, but on a sound effects scale, I would instead probably do things not with regions, but instead routing things to different channels. And then doing the thing where you render individual channels or tracks in Reaper. And if you do tracks, then it will actually do that as one go. And then you could chop the tracks up, and then you could just do a quick automate chopping up the tracks up later.
Okay, I see. So you suspect that if it is on every region, if you have 6 regions on the same track, every time it's rendering a region, it is effectively reloading the project. So does that mean that the software synthesizer, which is being triggered to create that sound effect, is it something to do with the way that the clock works to decide on how? So basically, if it's always being triggered from 000 in your project, it will always sound exactly the same?
I think so.
Perhaps?
I think so. Okay. It's hard to say because I can only imagine what are the particular synths that you're using. But from what I imagine with some of the things that I use for sample stuff, as well as some of the things that are pseudo-random. There are some contact instruments that I have that are pseudo-random. Synthful, which is like a weird synth not modeling thing I have is pseudo random, and it actually behaves in a similar way, where if you do these things and you just, okay, I'm going to take this chunk, copy, paste, and re-render all those sections, try to render them individually and capture the randomness between them, it won't, because it's just seeded the same way.
Okay, interesting. Okay. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is how to use the environment view in Logic.
I'm sorry, Alex, did you say you had a question about the EXS24? Because that's renamed a sampler, just so you know.
I think Mike's internet connection just sort of dropped off there for about 5 minutes. He's back now, so you missed some hot Logic Pro talk there, Mike.
Oh man!
Actually, let's make this expanded a little bit more generally, because this is something that I've kind of messed around a bit with. Been doing some different projects, and there have been a couple times where I thought, okay, I'll just have a folder of projects, and each individual Reaper project that I have corresponds to an individual sound effect, which is a little bit silly, but it didn't seem silly to me at the time. Nowadays, I actually do set things up kind of similar to what I was talking about before, except a project corresponds to a whole game, and I'm going to have folders of tracks that correspond to sound effects, and subfolders and subtracks that are going to be the individual components of them. And that works out really well for me because, oh, here's this sound effect a couple tracks up that I worked on. I want to make sure that this really does complement the new sound effect that I've got here. You know, how do these things actually play against each other? So that's what I've been doing now. And doing that goes into what you were talking about before with how exactly do you render these things. These days, I render tracks rather than individual regions or individual items. You know, Reaper has all sorts of robust functionality for how you render, and these days I stick with rendering tracks, and that works pretty well for me. There's a little bit of stuff that might need to be done later on in terms of, you know, tops and tails, but that's all easily automated away at the end.
Cool. Actually, yeah, I used to work the same. I've gone the other direction. Yeah, so I used to have everything in the one project, and after a while, I just didn't like the feeling of seeing a tiny, tiny little window of this massive, massive thing. So I'm thinking of Reaper's sort of main arrange view. Like, where did I put that? And like kind of using the middle mouse button to kind of pan around this huge, huge canvas of all of these regions and clips and stuff. And I didn't really like that. And I think that when Reaper gained the capability quite a few years ago to have these tabs, project tabs, and the fact that Reaper projects are so light and they load up so quickly, I thought, okay, now's the time. So that's when I actually started working the opposite way, which is the way that you used to work, where I have a separate file, a separate Reaper project for every individual sound, unless they are related together. Like, obviously, if you're going to have, you know, footsteps, it's like footsteps Foley and stuff like that. It's much more logical to have them in the same project so that you can make sure the volume is consistent and things like that. But I'm actually curious because I've always wanted to know, Mike and Chase, I've always wanted to know with you guys, when you're like Mike, I know you work with templates. If you have one game that say has 10 cues in it, will that all be in one Logic project, or will you split them out for different cues?
Well, speaking for myself, I will typically have a separate project for each cue. But in some cases, I will also have a project-wide project, that's a terribly awkward phrase, where I will import the latest render of each cue and put it on a timeline. So I essentially am modeling the entire timeline. This is more typical for film or TV or something linear. But then I'll consolidate them all there. And then at the end of the project, I'll also have kind of a mastering project where I can apply effects and balance things easily and then export from there. But in the sense that I think you're asking the question, I don't typically combine more than one cue in a single project unless they are variants of each other, or in some other way directly related or sharing a palette.
Cool. I see. How about you, Chase?
Yeah, I definitely learned in early days that I do not put 10 cues in one project. There's only one composer who writes for games that does that, and I salute him greatly because
Is this
he's
Will?
taking a lot of risk. Yes, it is.
I think it's crazy. Like, I mean, on one hand, it kind of makes sense because, like, okay, fixed ensemble, project, ensemble, okay, Q, 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 Q. I mean, he uses Reaper. He's not even using sub-projects in Reaper. It's just one right after the other. And it still strikes me as crazy, but I do get the logic of it.
There's nothing illogical about it. It's just I come from the background of computers crash. And in my age of teenage growing up, computers crashed a lot. And so there are things called corrupt files. And I mean, this sometimes still happens, not nearly as much as it did, especially like 5 or something years ago. But if I was to have all those cues in one project and that one file is corrupt for everything, I am screwed.
Yeah.
And I'm not doing that. So therefore, I'm always stemming out, even if I have, I mean, if you look at my project thing for anything that I write, I have like a tier system of like 01, 02, 03, 02, 02, 03. I am not playing around because I cannot afford to lose any of that stuff. I put way too much time and effort into it. So yeah.
I'll add as a addendum that where notation is concerned, I am actually moving more towards the consolidation of cues into one project file, just because Dorico makes that so easy. And in that case, it is really, and the Dorico footprint of data is so small that you don't feel like you're waiting for a lot of stuff to load up, even if you have 10 or 12 or 20 cues in one Dorico project. But in that case, the shared resources like formatting and other things actually ends up being a workflow plus. But the considerations there are different than when you're working on a data-heavy DAW project.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah. This is cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's kind of like when you're talking about music, it's kind of like mix as you go versus track, then mix as a completely separate process. Like everybody has different reasons and different workflow that they're comfortable with. Speaking of which, do you guys mix as you go along, or do you mix after the fact?
I generally mix as I go
I do
along.
a little both.
I do both.
Oh, you both?
Yeah, I'll do kind of like I'll have it in reasonable shape as I go, and then I'll always have a polish pass at the end of a project.
Right.
Yeah, I do both in the respect of depending on the cue I'm writing. So right now I'm writing something for a Metroidvania Jam game. Surprise! And this time I'm not mixing. I'm just like, okay, I have to focus on the composition. It's a different style. I haven't done this in a while. I need to like, I'll barely like, I mean, the little most mixing I'll do is just like, I'll just pan something. It's just like, but it's very slight. It's just like, if I think about it, cool. But if not, like, I just need to write. But there's other things, whereas then I know, yeah, I've got to shape this out. I've got to carve out this low end. I've got to kind of do that. But every time I do it, I get faster and faster. So it's almost as if I'm not even thinking about it anymore.
Right.
Yeah, there's like 101 plus several thousand videos on YouTube, especially with regard to music production, and especially when we're talking like electronic music, dance music, techno, and EDM and stuff like that. They'll all say the same thing, and that is separate your mixing into a separate phase from your tracking, so that you can focus on the music and then focus on the sculpt, getting the sound. I've tried so many times to do that, it just never works. And I think the reason is that maybe potentially for the kind of music that I write, or maybe it's a game audio thing, I don't know. You need to feel that excitement as you go along. And it's really hard to do that when everything is just sounding so raw, Whereas if you're mixing as you're going along, yes, you do run the risk of getting down the rabbit hole of being obsessive about sound design when you really should be thinking about the music. That is a risk. But the result is, of course, that it's much easier to get a lot more excited about what you're doing as you're doing it. For example, if you've just put together some drums, if you get them really, really slapping, then it just feels great. And then you can start, new ideas come to mind, and it just sort of so much more inspiring than just working with raw samples to keep everything sort of segmented by workflow phase, I think. So unfortunately, yes, despite the 101 million YouTube videos that recommend mixing as a separate phase, I'm definitely in the mix as you go along camp.
Mm-hmm.
This, I think, is also a use case for these all-in-one black box type plugins where they purport to let you set your entire mix just by turning a knob or giving you a very simplified set of controls, and the knobs are tied to some EQ and compression, a little bit of distortion. Or, speaking of black boxes, or something like the HG2, which offers a certain amount of tonal processing and a little bit of compression-ish functionality. But if you've got something you can throw in your mix bus that will make your mix sound a little brighter and a little more upfront very quickly, that can kind of do as a stand-in for your later mix process. So as Alex says, you can feel like your mix is exciting and it kind of keeps your motivation going and maybe adds a little bit of clarity without bogging you down. So those plugins are useful, I think, in those scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. We have a interesting discussion going on our YouTube chat feed at the moment. Radius Cast has a great question, actually, that we can maybe talk about for a bit. Radius Cast says, I live in Northern Ireland. Is it possible for me to work remotely, like for a project in the States?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think even before the current situation where working remotely is much more sort of commonplace now with the coronavirus situation, even before that, working remotely on projects in other countries, absolutely. I think we've all done it. And it's fantastic. It really, it's such a rewarding experience. You have, of course, the challenge of how do you communicate effectively when you're doing that? Time zones and work. Where does your work time line up with when your clients are in their business hours? Those are all challenges, but they're not difficult to overcome. But there's absolutely no reason why, if you're based in Northern Ireland, there's no reason why, especially, if you're doing great stuff, there's absolutely no reason, even less reason right now with the coronavirus situation, that somebody would think, oh, Northern Ireland, well, they're not based in the States. I'm not going to be contracting them. Not going to happen now. So.
Yep. I've been pretty fortunate. I've gotten a couple of gigs recently, and they've all been remote, and not just kind of remote, but really quite remote. So, for example, I'm dealing with a client in Brazil right now, which is 4 time zones away and the other hemisphere away. And so far, it's been great. So working remotely is fantastic. I really like it. Even now, it's actually been really fantastic because I'm actually meeting more people now than I was previously. Everyone is now accepting this new normal, and I think there are some positive aspects to it.
Yeah, I can't think of. I mean, I'm trying to think of negative aspects to it. Really, I guess finding those opportunities is so much harder when you are not, in. For example, if you don't happen to live in a sort of a super hot spot of game development activity, then it may be a little bit harder to sort of find those opportunities. Although now, again, it's very curious and strange how the coronavirus situation has sort of, in a funny way, leveled the playing field a lot internationally. Previously, places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, New York, maybe Austin, maybe, then Tokyo, Stockholm, London. These are sort of like the real hotspots for game audio activity. Now, though, it just sort of doesn't really matter that much anymore, especially if you're doing good work.
Yeah. Whew. Let's see. Let's keep on moving on with the topics because there's been some interesting stuff happening on the internet lately. As the internet is wont to have, there's controversy. A couple months ago, actually, was when I first saw the advertisements come up on Facebook for this big Spitfire Westworld scoring competition. And I looked at it and I really wanted to ignore it, and it just kept on blasting its presence at me whenever I logged into social media. I did not join in the contest. Did any of you submit anything? No?
Nope.
That's fine. I didn't need to. It's like, okay, I've got work to do. It's cool. But quite a few people did. More than 11,000 people entered this competition. And it ended with an ultimate winner. And when that winner was announced, this dude, David, the internet boiled over on a couple of places. There were definitely some forum responses that said things along the lines of, oh, that's funny, I can't believe that won. And other people that were even more harsh in their criticism, basically saying, oh, wow, that is a bad entry, or what were the judges thinking? You know, things along those lines. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of comments that can be found on this, on places like Facebook and VI Control and all those forums that are discussing this particular contest right now. And it's really, really crazy. Did you guys have any comments on this? I certainly have some strong opinions, but I've been talking enough right now. Do you have any comments?
Yeah,
Vince.
first of all,
Oh,
good
sorry,
on him. Sorry,
Okay.
just want to say this real quick. Good on him.
go.
Congratulations to you. It's different. It's refreshing, and I don't care. No, just kidding. No, but all seriousness, I mean, it's all subjective, right? And everyone's gonna give their opinions about everything else. But I mean, they won for a reason, and it's probably because it stood out from whatever else, you know, the other composer wasn't doing or other people weren't doing. So it stood out, and it stood out in that way, and that's why I won.
Yeah, Vince, you probably should just brief people who might not have actually seen the winning entry what it is that actually is potentially controversial about the way that the winning entry was scored.
Well, let's see. So, what was the thing that was being scored? First of all, it was a pretty long, it was about 5 minutes or so, of a scene from Westworld, which is not a show that I'm super familiar with, but it's pretty popular. It's a car chase scene. And what the composer did was he composed this score, which really had two distinct tones present, and it shifted between them and combined them throughout the whole cue. You had this hybrid orchestral tone that it started out with, but then you had this gamey sound, and very specifically a retro or 8-bit game sound sensibility. It wasn't just synths, it was old school video game-like synths. And I thought it was pretty good. I mean, my first response to it was, I wonder if I would do that. But hey, this is actually pretty good. There's some good writing in it. My biggest criticism when I first heard the cue was that I wish that the 8-bit stuff used stuff that was more idiomatic of what 8-bit composers would do. But I thought it was still a pretty well done entry. I certainly didn't think it was a joke of an entry, which was what was either intimated or explicitly stated by a lot of the salty forum goers out there on the internet.
I would be curious to see actually what the brief was from Spitfire. Like, what actually did they want? Like, is it just score this, do what you like, see how you go? Or was there actually some sort of specific thing that they wanted contestants to sort of touch on in terms of like the aesthetic objective? Because I think that really is, as it is in our work, if the client says, I want something like this, or I want something a bit different, or the client says, go crazy, do what you like, I don't care, then our role as sort of, you know, vendors, I guess, is to aim for that target. So if Spitfire said, we want it scored traditionally, we want it as a viable commercial kind of thing, then the entry is a bit ridiculous and obviously, could easily be sort of misunderstood as being tongue-in-cheek or just sort of taking the piss out of the whole thing. However, if Spitfire didn't say that and they just said, we don't care, go have fun, do what you like, he did. He did exactly that.
I think it's worth noting that there are some shows for which this kind of metatextual, very overtly stylistic, reference-like approach would have been very much in the pocket. I'm thinking of Legion, for example, where that show was really crazy, both narratively and in its use of music. And had that been the excerpt, I don't think there would have been a lot of complaints by this kind of a stylistic shift that was so overt and so triggered by a specific line of dialogue in the scene. Because I think the robot, I think they're referring to like one of the Westworld androids, and I think they say like he changed genre or something like that. And it struck me as that was the trigger for the stylistic choice. So one of the objections may be that this approach does not match the sensibility of the particular show, which then raises the question, in the context of a competition, are you expected to act as if you are picking up where the show left off, or are you using this as kind of an out-of-context action scene and doing with it what you will? And I would argue for a contest, it's much more the latter, that you shouldn't feel constrained by the stylistic baggage of the show, either narratively or musically. It's a contest, right? They're not picking the next composer for this show. It is specifically set up to be an exercise and a showcase for creativity. So if you accept that as the starting conditions, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, if Spitfire said, act as if you're really scoring the show. But if I'm not wrong, and this really is just meant to be show us your stuff, then I think kind of a zany approach like this is perfectly valid and also super smart. Because if you imagine the state of mind of J.J. Abrams after having listened to 10,999 demos, all of which sounded the same, and then having this show up in your inbox at 2 a.m. going, wow, that's crazy. Of course, that's going to have a better chance of being picked for a contest. So the lesson I think here is really ask yourself, what are the judges' criteria? And are you trying to get a gig, or are you doing something that's much more showy and much more like a class homework assignment? And in the latter case, I think this kind of creativity is a very good strategy.
Agreed.
Yeah, that's basically exactly what I said, except put far more eloquently.
Yeah. I think one thing I want to mention, though, is that for as zany as this was, and I totally agree that you approach scoring a show differently from submitting for a contest. Totally agree with that. I think that actually this zany approach is not all that zany because of what is actually going on. The original score for the show was actually not original score. This whole genre switching thing that actually happens with the main character there in this car chase, that is actually manifested in the score by a switch to Ride of the Valkyries. So in the actual Westworld, in that car chase scene, they do not have original score. They have Ride of the Valkyries happening throughout that thing. So when I found that out, I thought, that doesn't seem that zany, because Ride of the Valkyries is basically a cliche at this point. It is kind of an in-joke. It is something that we all know, whether you're a music composer or just a film and television buff. Oh, this is something that signals something weird and crazy is happening, something over the top that I wasn't expecting. So actually, I think that this particular competition entry is very, very apropos even.
Yeah, actually, when I listened to it as well, I had the same, because I've never seen the series, ever. And so seeing that clip was the first I'd ever seen of the series itself. So I didn't know, actually, hearing what you've just said, Vince, confirms, because when I heard the chiptune stuff, I'm quite familiar with chiptune, as you would imagine, considering, I mean, look at my Twitter handle. Anybody's in the know who will know what that means. But anyway, when I heard it as well, I thought, wow, that's really strange that they would want to do chiptune at this point in this science fiction drama. That's a bit weird. But actually, when I'm listening to it, that's pretty well done. I also thought exactly what you said, Vince, as well. Are like, well, if you're going to do chiptune, take it all the way at least. Add in some of those
Arpeggios,
arpeggiated, and then that kind of stuff, or some vibrato or whatever. But take it all the way. But all right. That's when I realized, okay, this is not a joke. The guy is not, taking the piss out of the whole competition. He's seriously considered this and produced this and put a lot of time into that chiptune section. Now hearing what you've said, that the original has that musical genre switch into a cliche, and definitely, a bit of Wagner is sadly a cliche at this point, especially Ride of the Valkyries. I think it makes a lot more sense what he chose to do.
Yeah. So, some people chatting about this. It's never beneficial to be a sore loser and then posting about it. I do get the sense that there were a lot of sore losers out there, and I don't know if it's really worth it to be a sore loser. I mean, there's bound to be people that aren't going to get name recognition out of this simply because there are 11,000 other entries. What do you expect there? And now they are, in fact, putting their name on the internet with this comment about how, this thing isn't worthy, which is, I don't know, I think a little sad, a little disappointing.
In the Twitch channel, Rocktron has posted a really interesting comment, which I'd like to get your feedback on before we end the show. We're actually 1 minute over, but this is an interesting point. Rocktron says, I find the orchestral composers in game audio many times do not take seriously other music genres. It's not a rule, but it happens quite often. What do you think about that?
I do get a sense of that. I've never really defined that specifically, but I do get that sense when I'm hanging out around people who deal a lot with the orchestra, whether it be live or synthesized, hybridized orchestra, that particular tone, that ensemble is that much more elevated compared to other forms, whether they're explicitly saying it or not. But it is more a feeling that I get rather than something that is explicitly said to me.
Mike, as an orchestral composer yourself, do you often hear that kind of sentiment with your colleagues and people in the same sort of field as you?
I think it's too broad a generalization to make. I think prejudice is more likely to be generational than by genre of music. In other words, people who are older might resent or not connect to the styles of music, including orchestral music, coming from younger composers. But someone whose idea of orchestral scoring goes back to the 70s might not really resonate with the kind of orchestral scoring that's done today. I think that's more likely to be a source of friction. Are there a lot of orchestral purists in game audio who really turn their nose up at hybridization or eclecticism, or using folk elements, or using 8-bit? They used to be primitive, now they're cool instruments as well. I would say no. I think kind of eclecticism is built into anyone working today, by and large.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I feel like if you're gonna be, for lack of a better word, if you're gonna be a snob and about that, like in game audio, I think you really should look at first, just look at yourself and look at the history, because it wasn't always orchestral music. The history shows that a lot of rock influences happened, a lot of hip hop influences happened, a lot of jazz influences happened before, when it was just the technology with the limitations, and only until the PlayStation kind of happened, whereas and it was able to stream that music, whereas like where MIDI was decently good, where orchestral pieces actually implemented and put forward. But until then, they were trying to remock up those styles and do the best they could with those FM chips and such. And so you got to really ask yourself, like, to be at least game composer, you're going to want to at least write in some different styles. And I don't really see the gamut, especially with all the indie games and all the projects that are in AAA and different variations. Like, we're moving into another area, especially with VR, and so it's not always going to be like that. So I think it's definitely a reflection of everything you got to kind of take a look at.
Yeah, I agree with that. Rocktron, it's not Rockatron. Sorry. I'd seriously have to question the background of these orchestral composers in game audio that Rockatron is talking about, because when you're talking about game audio, yeah, it's like, I feel like orchestral music in game audio is not really the norm, actually. If you took at the whole scope of, the history of game audio, where it began, I think it was a sort of a goal to achieve something that sounded that good. But yeah, I mean, you think of all of those classic console games, classic, Commodore games and Amiga games, and none of them are orchestral in the sense of what we would think of as an orchestral game score. So I think, it's a curious opinion to have. But anyway, interesting topic for discussion.
Yeah. Ooh. Well, let's see. We're already well over our hour, but I do want to keep on going because Chase, your shirt reminded me. You've got that Krotos shirt, although if you move back a little bit, it's a Chase Bethea shirt. But but there you go. Yeah, it is in fact Krotos. They're doing some interesting things when it comes to selling their product lately. You want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just got the email today, hot off the press. You're hearing it live on Game Audio Hour. Krotos is releasing their interest-free monthly payments for their products. Now, let me be clear. This is not a subscription service. What this means is you can do monthly payment plans to own their products, like Reformer, Weaponizer, Sound Design Bundles. And in my email, it says like, you have 6 interest-free payments for $66. So whatever the amount is for Reformer Pro, what that adds up to be, you pay 6 months of $66. Boom, you own it. And this is kind of cool because I remember speaking to them, doing an interview at GDC, I believe last year or maybe the year before. It's on our YouTube channel. And just off camera and such, I remember speaking about, hey, like, could you like rent to own, or could you like do payments in increments for people who couldn't afford the products just outright? And they said, like, I remember the owner, Orpheus, he was like, yeah, we're actually considering that. We've been hearing a lot of feedback, and we're thinking about how to go about it. And so they seem to have partnered a company called Split It, and it even says, we've listened to your feedback and we are pleased to offer a new way to pay for your Krotos purchase. So this is really exciting.
Haven't retailers been doing this themselves for years? Like, doesn't Sweetwater let you buy something and pay it in installments?
Yeah, that's hardware, right? Or do they do software too?
I feel like they do anything. I mean, if you're a retailer, you can set up whatever kind of payment plan you want, irrespective of the thing you're buying. So it's cool that the original producers of these things are applying that to direct sales. But I'm not sure it's like cutting edge e-commerce.
Yeah, I'm not sure it is, in fact, cutting edge e-commerce, but it does strike me as interesting that I think about all the plugins and software libraries and sound design tools that are not this model, or that have specifically gone for a subscription model. I guess famously East-West, but also different companies that are offering their products as available on this subscription model. Roland does this as well. Although they're also doing a couple of things where you can also purchase in addition to the subscription. But I certainly see more of this subscription model as opposed to pay in installments to eventually outright own.
Right. And typically, since this is involved within like most, they're catering to like game audio, like professionals and such, using sound design tools and other things that they push. I thought this was, at least somewhat exciting to kind of like at least share in that regard too.
Yeah. Dehumanizer is cool. I played around with it a bit and I thought, man, this is pretty good at what it does. And especially compared to the original Dehumanizer. I played around with that back in 2013, 2014. I thought, okay, this is cool, but I figured I could probably do something similar with some of the Pure Data patches that I was messing with. And then Dehumanizer 2 kind of kicked it out and said, oh no, this is what we really want to do. So those guys do pretty good work over there at Krotos.
So just for fun, I popped over to Sweetwater, and it does look like they do installment purchases on just about everything. I just looked up Omnisphere, so it looks like you can, do that on a payment plan. It looks like you can, just pretty much do installment payment on everything. But I'll play devil's advocate to my own devil's advocacy and say that what is good about the original plugin manufacturers offering this, in addition to maybe cutting out a little bit of padding from the middleman, is that it staves off the specter of subscription. Because if a company decides to go all subscription, then there's nothing a retailer can do. Like, the retailer can no longer offer you the installment plan. So it is actually good that this is being offered closer to the source.
Yeah. Whew, man. All right. We're already going long on this show, so we should probably come to an end pretty shortly, but we can't do that before we talk about what media we're consuming right now. So who would like to go first? So, what are you doing? What are you playing, or what are you listening to?
I just finished listening to the soundtrack for Bastion, that game from like a couple of years ago, which I'd only seen. I'd never actually played it, but I watched some gameplay, and it was pretty cool. It was it was sort of an eclectic approach to a number of acoustic or electroacoustic styles, all layered over these aggressive and sometimes humorous beats, but with a common stylistic palette to which the score returns often is a kind of Beck-esh American folk kind of acoustic guitar thing. So the combination of that with beats is a really cool sound. So it almost makes me want to go play the game.
You should.
I'm too lazy.
Yeah, it's a good game. It's a good game. I'll go next. I recently, or just earlier this month, I got notice that this album that I kickstarted is finally just about ready for sale, and I got to listen to the early cut of it. This is Jeremy Levy's The Planets Reimagined, and the reimagining is an arrangement for jazz orchestra, which I think is a really excellent arrangement. There's some just really good ones. Mercury is great. Jupiter is great. So that was a really fun thing for me to listen to. And because I was a Kickstarter backer, I also was able to check out the score for this album. And it's been actually really nice to study it and bone up on some of my jazz arrangement chops.
Cool. Chase?
So I've been playing Breath of the Wild every night because it's just been soothing and slowly gearing into Star Wars The Fallen Order. But, and I haven't announced this yet, I actually just won the soundtrack from the show The Last Kingdom. And it's going to be on vinyl. So I am very excited to get that in my hands and listen to that wonderful TV show soundtrack, because I just think the instrumentation, the quality, the themes are just so just butter and grease and good. It's all those things.
Smooth.
Cool. Yeah, I've speaking of soothing, I've been listening to a lot of an Australian acoustic guitar player called Tommy Emmanuel, who is a great, like he's a legend in Australia as far as acoustic guitar goes. But he's a master at fingerstyle acoustic guitar playing, making it sound like there's three of him playing when there's only one. Definitely check out anything by Tommy Emmanuel. Actually, a lot of the interviews that you can find with him are wonderful. He's a real sort of quintessential Australian character. So, yeah, that's what I've been listening to. Very soothing. Soothing is the name of the game. Whew. See what I did there?
Tom in the chat concurs. Tommy is amazing. Maybe it's just all these Toms getting together, watching each other's back.
They're taking over, Vince. They're taking over.
They are. But before they can take over, we have to end the show. It's been a great hour and 15 minutes. So, wow, thank you, Alex, Mike, Chase for joining me, and thank you to all of our watchers and listeners for joining in on the chat and chiming in. It's really cool to see you guys live and contributing to this show and its continued life out here on the internet. You can always follow us on Twitter, like us on YouTube, and follow us on Twitch as well, where we're broadcasting on all those platforms. And until next time, bye.